In our imagination, a stagecoach often appears exactly as it is shown in old westerns. The sun is setting, the wheels are clattering rhythmically along the road, and the wagon is filled with a motley crew united by one road. There is a silent cowboy with a firm gaze, a lady in a lace dress, and a joker who tries to lighten the mood with a few sharp words. The plot develops rapidly. A sudden chase, an ambush, an unexpected hero who saves the situation. All this looks like an adventure in which dangers are just a reason to show courage, and the road is a stage for personal victories and romantic stories. Hollywood has learned to present these shots in such a way that the viewer can almost smell the fresh dust, taste the whiskey in a roadside saloon, and feel the excitement of meeting the unknown. The stagecoach in such films seems comfortable and even spacious, and the long journey is an opportunity to meet new people and see wild but majestic spaces. In these stories, the journey always leads to something significant, to a new beginning, to glory, or to returning home with honor. But behind this picture lies a completely different side, which cinema prefers not to show. Real passengers of 19th century stagecoaches would hardly recognize themselves in these stories. Their journey was rarely romantic. More often it turned into a series of trials, where every hour of the journey became more and more difficult. The vast expanses that seemed to be a symbol of freedom in films, in reality meant grueling distances, lack of shelter, and a constant struggle with nature. The romanticization of these trips played a role in shaping the image of the Wild West, a place where everyone could prove themselves, their courage and endurance. The stagecoach became a symbol of striving forward, perseverance, and readiness to face any difficulties head-on. But to understand how far this symbol is from reality, you need to look behind the facade of cinema and see what really awaited people on these roads, and this journey will turn out to be much less glossy than we are used to. When in the early 19th century, the masters of the city of Concord, New Hampshire, presented their new product, it immediately became a source of pride for the American stagecoach business. This carriage was designed to withstand thousands of miles on a variety of roads without breaking down after every serious impact. An engineering find, suspension on leather straps, the so-called thoroughbraces, allowed the body not to shake on every bump as it did with earlier models. For travel on relatively smooth roads of the East, this was a real breakthrough, and the design remained almost unchanged for more than 70 years. But the word comfort in these descriptions was a relative concept. Inside, the Concorde was a space a little over 4 feet wide and about 4.5 feet high, so cramped that it was impossible to stand up straight. 6, 9, sometimes 12 people were crammed shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee, often with strangers, with no room to move. When mailbags or personal baggage were added, every extra item became a threat to comfort, and sometimes even safety. Mark Twain, who experienced this journey, described moments when a sudden jerk would leave all the passengers in a heap against the front wall, or, conversely, almost standing on their heads. Another traveler recalled how, bouncing over bumps, he would hit the hard seat, the ceiling, or the side of the carriage. On the western routes, glass windows were replaced by leather or canvas curtains, because fragile glass would crumble in an instant from the endless shaking. This meant that there was no protection from dust, rain, or freezing wind inside. On a hot day, the scorching air mercilessly burned the lungs, and on a cold day, the piercing draft turned the journey into an endurance test. And all this on roads that were more of a direction than a real surface. Mud, rocks, deep ruts, and clouds of dust accompanied every mile of the journey. As soon as the wheels of the Concorde left the more or less developed eastern highways, the road turned into a test for which no city dweller was prepared. In the West, in the mid-19th century, the word highway meant more of a direction than an actual strip of hard surface. Often the path was a trampled dirt road, where in dry weather there were thick clouds of dust, and in the rain, the wheels and hooves got stuck. After a downpour, the road turned into a solid, sticky mass, and every step of the horses was a struggle to move forward. The weather dictated everything. The summer heat heated the ground to such an extent that the air rising from the road burned the face, and in winter the winds and snowfalls turned the trip into a painful trek through an icy desert. In the spring and autumn, mud traps were especially dangerous. The wheels sank up to the hub, and only the collective efforts of the passengers who jumped into the mud allowed the carriage to move. Some sections, especially on the swampy plains, had to be made with a cord road, a row of logs laid tightly together. This got rid of the sticky mud, but had the opposite effect. Each log hit the back of the truck like a hammer. Travelers recalled that after a few miles of this jolting, their bones felt loose and their teeth ready to fly out. The speed was humiliatingly slow. Where a modern car would cover the distance in 2 or 3 hours, a stagecoach could travel for days. The average daily distance was often only a few miles, and the continuous journey from Saint Louis to San Francisco took about 25 grueling days, with no real rest and no opportunity for sleep. By the end of the second or third day, the passengers' bodies were exhausted to the limit. The constant jolting left bruises on the shoulders and hips. The stiff muscles ached with every movement, and the head buzzed from the endless clatter of the wheels. But what was worse, there were always many miles ahead, and no guarantee that it would get easier. For tired passengers, the sight of a building by the road meant only one thing: a stop was coming. But the hope for a break almost always turned into disappointment. The so-called way stations and small stops existed mainly for the purpose of changing horses, and not for the convenience of people. In most cases, all that could be obtained was 10 or 15 minutes, while the driver and grooms changed the harness and checked the wheels. Where the stop was a little longer, food and lodging were offered, but this rather aggravated the fatigue. The table was set with the simplest provisions: pieces of salted bacon or ham, flatbreads, and the almost legendary dry apple pie among travelers. A dish that, according to eyewitnesses, people wanted to try only once. Local innkeepers knew that their guests could not go to a competitor, and they charged for the food as much as they considered necessary, without worrying about quality. Granville Stewart, who crossed these routes, recalled that the menu did not change from station to station, and sometimes it was even prepared without observing basic cleanliness. One of the drivers told how he saw the owner gently stroking a dog, and then without the slightest pause kneading dough for cookies. Complaints about dirt were met with a grin. The owners assured that it is useful for everyone to eat their bucket of dust in life. It's just that here, they tried to give out this amount in one go. Overnight stay was a separate test. Women were often placed together in one room, and men slept 2, or even 3 or 4 to a bed, with people they were seeing for the first time in their lives. No one talked about clean sheets or personal space. The air was heavy, smelling of a mixture of smoke, sweat, and old straw. Any hope of getting a good night's sleep was dashed by the noise, the cramped quarters, and the restlessness of the neighbors. As a result, the morning brought no relief. Fatigue only accumulated, and the road seemed to become even longer. If the cramped conditions, shaking, and bad food could exhaust a person physically, then the lack of basic hygiene turned a journey by stagecoach into a test at the survival level. Of course, there were no amenities inside the carriage, and the need to relieve oneself was solved simply. A stop off the road, where everyone looked for at least some shade or bush in order to somehow preserve their dignity. But on the open plains, there was almost no shelter, and awkwardness became another inevitable companion of the journey. It was almost impossible to wash on the road. At the stations, horse drinking troughs served as wash basins, where animals drank in the same trough and passengers' hands splashed around. Sometimes they offered a common towel, which had already been in the hands of dozens of people, and a single guest toothbrush, which not everyone dared to use. After a couple of days of travel, clothes were soaked with dust and sweat, skin itched, and hair matted into stiff strands. Sleeping in shared beds with strangers often ended with a new gift: fleas, lice, or bed bugs, which could be picked up in just one night. But much more dangerous were the diseases that spread along such routes. Cholera, carried through contaminated water, could kill a person in less than a day, dehydrating to a dangerous state. Dysentery was accompanied by high fever and debilitating attacks. Typhus and so-called mountain fever mowed down entire groups of travelers. Medical care along the way was almost non-existent. Most relied on their own supplies of simple potions, such as bark infusion or alcohol, which was considered a universal medicine. The understanding that disease was caused by invisible microbes was just beginning to break through in scientific circles, and among ordinary people, everything was attributed to bad air or the curse of an unfortunate place to spend the night. In these conditions, any illness became a serious test, because the road did not wait. The horses changed, the carriage went on, and the patient had to go to the next station, no matter how hard it was for him. In cinematography, a stagecoach almost always rushes across the prairie surrounded by racing horsemen, and the main danger is a shootout with raiders or a furious chase. But in reality, the threat often crept up, not from behind a hill with a revolver in hand, but from under the wheels or from the very heart of the mechanism. A breakdown halfway to the destination was not an exception, but a common occurrence. A broken axle, a torn wheel, or a broken suspension could leave passengers in the middle of the wasteland for many hours or even days. Sometimes the cause was the fatigue of the horses, which simply fell from exhaustion, or the mistake of the driver, who decided to take the descent too quickly. Rivers and bridges were especially treacherous. Wooden ferries, not designed for heavy loads, sometimes broke under the wheels, and the stagecoach ended up in the water, dragging mail bags, baggage, and people along with it. The high center of gravity made the carriage extremely unstable. One wrong move, and it would tip over, pressing the passengers to the ground. Robberies, although they did happen, rarely looked like spectacular duels from movies. More often, everything happened quietly and quickly. The carriage stopped when the road went uphill or the horses slowed down, and people came out of the bushes with a clear demand to hand over valuables and mail. Sometimes the role of robbers was played by famous gentlemen of fortune, like the famous Black Bart, who was known to be polite and even left thank you notes. But more often they were rude and unpredictable people for whom the lives of passengers did not mean much. A separate topic remains the way Hollywood depicts clashes with indigenous peoples. On screen, they are almost always ruthless enemies who attack without reason. The historical reality is much more complex. Conflicts arose because of the theft of horses or mules, resistance to land grabs, retaliation for ruined camps, and cattle rustling. Attacks did happen, but their frequency and scale were greatly exaggerated, and some crimes were committed by white bandits dressed as Indians to direct the anger of settlers to local tribes. Thus, real dangers rarely looked like they were shown on screen, and this only made them more unpredictable and frightening. You could never know whether a wheel would break tomorrow, whether a bridge would be flooded by a stream, or whether people would come around the corner ready to take everything you had. A long stagecoach ride was not only a test of the body, but also a test of character. When 6 or 9 people found themselves in a cramped space, where every jerk of the wheels threw them into each other, personal boundaries quickly disappeared. At first, this gave rise to awkward smiles and attempts at polite conversation. But after hours, and especially days, fatigue began to destroy any diplomacy. Any little thing, too much laughter, a smell from a travel bag, or a neighbor's habit of humming under his breath could become a source of irritation. To at least partially maintain order, companies like Wells Fargo posted codes of conduct at stations. Do not drink from a communal flask, do not spit into the wind, do not fall asleep while slumped on a neighbor's shoulder, and do not argue about politics or religion. They even instructed not to talk about places where stagecoaches had been attacked or horses killed in the past, so as not to escalate the situation. Women were to give up their seats and men were to refrain from using rude language. These instructions seemed trivial, but in a confined space, each of them could be the difference between saving a fight. The driver, or whip as he was called, occupied a special place in this small social universe. His skill determined whether the passengers would arrive safely. He controlled the 6 or 8 horses, knew every dangerous track and turn, and could judge when the animals needed a rest or a dash up the hill. But he received little for this work and worked grueling hours in all weathers. In the front seat next to him was often a shotgun messenger, an armed guard accompanying valuable cargo. For him, the journey was even more dangerous. In the event of an attack, he became the first target. These people risked their lives for a relatively modest fee, but it was they who often determined whether a parcel or a cash box would reach its destination. The passengers themselves were surprisingly diverse. Soldiers and priests, traders and adventurers, officials, and those who went west in search of health could find themselves in the same wagon. For some, the trip was a necessity. For others, a chance to change their lives. But they all had one thing in common: the understanding that they would spend these days together, sharing the cramped quarters, fatigue, and constant readiness for the unexpected. In such circumstances, even a casual smile or a short conversation became rare but valuable islands of human warmth. A real journey on a stagecoach in the 19th century was far from what the imagination brought up on Western's paints. It was a journey where every hour tested a person's strength, both physical and internal. Behind the legend of the romance of the Wild West, there was everyday life, in which dust got into the eyes and mouth, joints ached from the endless shaking, and each stop brought not rest, but new trials. There were no beautiful decorations and pre-written heroic deeds here, only the need to continue the journey, whatever it was. Yet it was precisely this harshness that gave rise to a special respect for those who dared to board the stagecoach. It didn't matter whether it was a merchant driving goods west, a family looking for a new home, or a courier delivering important papers. They all accepted the same conditions: cramped quarters, lack of sleep, the risk of illness, breakdown, and attack. Each of them fought his own little struggle, and in this struggle he revealed qualities that go unnoticed in peacetime: patience, the ability to adapt, the ability to stick together in the most cramped and uncomfortable circumstances. Hollywood made the stagecoach a symbol of fearlessness and freedom, but in reality it was a symbol of necessity and endurance. Riding one meant being prepared to endure days of deprivation of comfort, to face unpredictable dangers, and still keep moving forward. It was a road that toughened everyone who walked it, and that's why the real story of the stagecoach is so much more impressive than any movie version. After all, there are no fictional feats in it. There are only real people who are capable of enduring everything that the road has in store for them and reaching the end.